And I say, look at Paul. Paul has to explain something monumental. Why doesn't anybody know that the Messiah is supposed to suffer, die, and rise on the third day? Paul has to say the opposite of what Deuteronomy says. It's a secret, and only I know about it. Bingo. That's exactly what a false religion has.
Hello, everyone. I'm here with Rabbi Tovia Singer. Rabbi Tovia Singer is an American Orthodox rabbi and the founder and director of Outreach Judaism. Singer is the author of the book and audio series, Let's Get Biblical. Why doesn't Judaism accept the Christian Messiah? Rabbi, thanks so much for coming on.
Hey, it's always a joy to join you. Thank you for having me.
Yep. So one thing that you're very known for defending is defending against the Christian charge that Isaiah 53 is about Jesus. Isaiah 53 famously is a passage where it talks about a suffering servant. Christians very often read this passage and think, I know a suffering servant, and so they think it's about Jesus. And so you know that in various other places, first, do you want to just sort of lay out your basic views on Isaiah 53 and why you think it's not about Jesus?
So that's really easy. So it is axiomatic that the author of Isaiah presuppose that if you're reading the 53rd chapter, as any author would of a large book, that you have read the chapters that introduce it. This becomes very important because about 90% of the book of Isaiah is poetry, right? So if you think the book of Isaiah is a cookbook, right? So cookbook, you don't have to read a recipe in context. You can just look up rotisserie chicken and go to page 53. Isaiah is definitely not a cookbook. And it's all poetry, which means it's highly dependent on the chapters that introduce it. Isaiah identifies the servant in those chapters. In Isaiah 41, 8 and 9, Isaiah tells us that the servant is Israel. In Isaiah 43, verse 10, we are told that the servant is many people. You are my witnesses, declares the Lord, my servant who I have chosen. 44:1, 21, 45:4, 44:1, 45:4, 48:20, and 49:3. So the servant is identified as Israel, and Isaiah 83 is simply the fourth of four servant songs. And what happens to these Christians, the reason they get themselves into so much trouble, is because they're in churches and not encouraged to read the entire book of Isaiah, but they're just told to read Isaiah 53 out of context. The other issue is that Christians, it's not their fault. It's not just Christians. Unless you're studying Isaiah, so you don't know who's speaking. Again, this is poetry. The author is not bound by the norms of prose that you would find in Joshua and Judges. So the speaker in Isaiah 53, now the term Isaiah 3 is generic. It really refers to 15 passages, Isaiah 52, 13 through 15, 53, 1 through 8, and 53, 9 through 12. In 53, 1 through 8, those who are speaking are the Gentile kings of nations. They're astonished because they are seeing something they had never heard. That's how Isaiah 52 ends. Kings will shut their mouths because of him for that which had not been told to them. They'll see that's what they had never heard. They'll finally witness. And they'll ask the question, Mi Hemen L'Shmuah, saying, who would have believed this? So the non-Jews of the world are astonished in the Messianic age. So this is a future prophecy where the nations will finally understand that not all Israel, not all the Jews, and it doesn't mean Bernie Madoff, not every Jew. It doesn't mean, Noam Chomsky. It means those who are devout Jews are the servant of God, and the nations of the world are stunned in amazement at that God has saved the children of Israel, but they're left with a dilemma, just very quickly. And the dilemma is, why then, if the Jews were right all along, why did they suffer? And they draw two conclusions. One is that the Jews suffered as a result of their own iniquities. That means they sinned by persecuting the Jewish people, and the Jews suffered as a direct result of their own sins. Until that point, the non-Jews presumed that the reason why God I just heard an anti-Semite on the other day on YouTube actually ask the question, horrible guy. He asked the question, why is it the Jews suffer so much? Like, why is, like, everybody's throwing them out of every country? Like, why? So there must be something wrong with the Jews. It's like guessing, like, why is it that children are molested by adults all the time? I mean, there must be something wrong with the children, like blaming the victim. So number one, they could realize that they were culpable for Jewish suffering. And number two, which is even more intriguing and ecstatic, is they realized that Jewish suffering triggered within them a desire to repent. There are many non-Jews who, upon encountering the suffering of the Jews, learn about the Shoah, the Holocaust, or of what happened October 7th. Many non-Jews are transformed by this. I know people who went to see Schindler's List, and it changed their lives forever. So by his stripes we were healed. God resumes speaking in verse 9 through 12. Those are 4 passages where God makes a deal with the servant, with Israel, and says to the servant that if you will, in fact, will be faithful, you will have children, have a long life, and the desire of God will prosper in your hand. So it's really magnificent, but I assure you of this. If you read Isaiah 53 out of context, you'll have no clue what's going on, and you could just put Jesus in there. You could put anything in there. So that's what's going on. They're just Christian, and you could try this out. If you ever encounter a Christian, ever, right? You might be on the internet, I would imagine, you encounter a Christian, and you get Isaiah 53 thrown at you, just ask the Christian, what does it say in 54 and 51 and 52? They have no idea. They only know this chapter out of context. Why? Because they're evil, Machiavellian, bad faith actors? No. This is how they're taught in churches.
Yeah. So I've raised this response to some of my Christian friends where I say to them, look, elsewhere in Isaiah, we don't have to guess who the servant is. Elsewhere in Isaiah, it says who the servant is. Right. It says the servant is Israel. And their response is generally that they invoke the notion of dual fulfillment, where they say one particular event can be fulfilled in multiple different ways. So it might be that there's a direct fulfillment in Israel, and then there's a second fulfillment in Jesus. And then they say that this makes sense of certain improbable features of the passage. So, for instance, when it describes the servant making his grave with the wicked, that doesn't make about as much sense talking about Israel. When it talks about him sprinkling many nations, that one doesn't make as much sense about Israel. When it talks about him pouring out his soul unto death, but then nonetheless living a long lifetime, they say that doesn't make as much sense talking about Israel. And so they say that overall, they're sort of, it's duly fulfilled in the 2 different important suffering servants. So I guess I'd be curious to hear what you make of that response.
Well, that's exactly the response you would expect from a Mormon, from any cult in the world, is that there's a dual fulfillment. I mean, don't you think the Mormons have apologetics? You could study this at Brigham Young University, where they go, well, there are passages that are in the Old Testament that are all pointing to Joseph Smith. When you go back to those texts, it's transparent. They're not talking about Joseph Smith. It's a dual fulfillment. What religion then could be dismissed? Muslims say that there are passages in the Hebrew Bible that are really a veiled reference to Muhammad. Why don't you convert to Islam? That means what's happening is that if anything can mean anything, right, then what religion then can be dismissed? Then every religion could be true. We're in the world of apologetics here, which means a rigorous defense of a faith. The vast majority of our planet is occupied by people who believe that there's a higher power. Like 95% of humanity believes that there is some higher power out there, right? It's obviously we're wired for this. I mean, it's obviously moreover, there is, I don't even have to provide evidence for this. There is no other creature on this planet that believes in God, or would even know what you're talking about if you can have a conversation with a dog. The dog just wouldn't know what you're talking about. So it's very obvious that we are somehow connected to this divine being and Judaism, it all makes sense. We're creating the image of God. We're wired for it. Our dogs and cats, as much as we love our pets, just they don't know. It's not that your pet can't solve algebraic equations, or your dog can't do your tax return for you because it doesn't have the. It's that it doesn't. It wouldn't even know what you're talking about, right? So once we go to dual fulfillment, so immediately you have announced your advertising that your religion is false, because that's you see the dual fulfillment means that it doesn't really say that. So it's like this. It's like the sale starts this way. If you come into the store, you get this, right? We all know this, right? You see an advertisement something that looks like too good to be true, right? And then when you get to the store, you're told, well, it doesn't really mean that. It means something else. You'd like call the Better Business Bureau or Second Coming. Like, of course, I want to get you into my religion, but I can't provide the currency to draw you in. So what I have to do is do this theological sleight of hand and go, it's a dual fulfillment. That's really quite silly. And if it is a dual fulfillment, are you saying that the Jews, that Israel died for the sins of the world? So it doesn't even make sense. That means, you're claiming Isaiah 83 is conveying vicarious atonement. This is very critical. So you see, what is the reason why? I presume you're an honest guy, right? And if you're pulled over by a cop, you're not going to start lying for a lot of reasons. Like you don't want to lie. I presume you're a nice fellow. But back there, you also don't want to get caught in your lies. And when you lie, you ultimately, the cover-up is what takes you down. So, so obviously they get themselves into trouble. Once you start becoming promiscuous with text, so you get into trouble. The problem with the dual fulfillment is you're saying Isaiah 83 is exemplary of vicarious atonement, where somebody dies for somebody else's sins, okay? Vicariously, okay? So if that's the case, and you're saying it's Israel and secondarily it's Jesus, that means you're saying the Jewish people could die vicariously for the sins of the world. So what do I need Jesus for? Do you understand? The whole thing collapses. It's really all quite silly. Now, you understand? There is another caveat to this, and that is that the Messiah is a member of the children of Israel. So he, like other Jews, suffer. That is our belief. That means it's not dual, it's single fulfillment. And the Mashiach, who is a member of the children of Israel from the tribe of Judah, he suffers like all Jews suffer. And the nations of the world are triggered by the suffering of the Jew.
Okay, so regarding the point about vicarious atonement, so might the Christian reply that, well, Jesus, that given that the prophecy is duly fulfilled, and I know you have some objections to that, but on their view it's duly fulfilled, they would say that the way in which Jesus fulfills it and the way in which Israel fulfills it are different. So they would agree with you about your interpretation of how Israel fulfills it, but then say, look, Jesus also fulfills it, and then point to the improbable features of the passage on the supposition that's only about Israel, like the one about having the grave with the wicked. This is what I imagine they'd say in response. I can see you don't look too convinced by this.
No one is. This is all like you have a friend. I'm going to guess you have a friend that smokes cigarettes, right? And you probably isn't like, why do you smoke? Why do you smoke? Don't you know it's going to kill you? Like, I'm sure I'm not sure, but you might have a friend who just has very bad habits, very unhealthy habits, right? He'll come up 500 at you. You ask your sister, why are you dating this guy? He's terrible. He's unfaithful, unloyal to you. And she comes up with all kinds of excuses. You realize what's happening here. So dual fulfillment is not an apologetics. This is another point. Okay, this is critical. If I may, this is so big, everyone misses this. If Christians want to say, I think this is a dual fulfillment, they're welcome to do that. But you're only welcome to do that as a homily in church. You could do that. You could say, I believe on faith, this is dual fulfillment. But you can't do this in the realm of apologetics. I'm not sure if you understand why. Because in the world of apologetics, what does that mean? It's a defense of your religion. You're in a courtroom, and you're providing evidence that your beliefs are true, right? You are providing evidence to a judge, my audience, that is true. So you have to provide evidence. You can't then provide some personal subjective belief that you have. It doesn't work. So this fails on every level. And of course, it makes naked that Christianity is a false religion. You can't use your personal homily. If you think there's something in the Bible that has some sort of, you're entitled to it, but don't tell me I have to believe your your torturous theology. The only way you can prove something is from the plain sense of the text, not from some far-reaching strange text. Moreover, Isaiah employs plurals in Isaiah 53, as he does in the other servant songs. As an example, Isaiah 53, verse 8, ends with the 4 words, Mi pesha ami negalamo, for the transgressions of my people, they were stricken. So how could that be referring to one person? It has to be referring to many. But moisav, in their deaths, it's plural. The Christian Bibles, of course, put it back to the singular. It means you could talk about a nation in the singular, right? You could talk about a nation like America, America thinks. So speaking about a country of nearly 350 million people, we're speaking about America is moving forward, right? But you can't speak about a single person in the plural. That doesn't make any sense. So in Isaiah 53, like in Isaiah 43, Isaiah is poetically saying, you are my witnesses, declares the Lord, my servant whom I have chosen. But so nothing works. It all fails. It's not vicarious atonement if it's talking about Jews, because the Jewish people are not suffering vicariously. The Jewish people suffer as a result, and the Jewish people's suffering triggers repentance among the non-Jews. So everything collapses. Now, if a Christian wants to believe it, you can do what you want. The problem is that Christianity is stuck with Tanakh. That means that Tanakh clearly states that the innocent cannot die vicariously as a result of the bad behavior of the wicked. That's not possible. Ezekiel 18:21-23.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess my last question about Isaiah 53. So some Christians when they hear this, they'll say, "Oh, but there are some things about the passage that just don't make sense if it's talking about Israel." So a common thing that they point to is the passage where it describes the suffering servant making his grave with the wicked and being with the rich at his death because he had done no violence. Where they say, I mean, first of all, that Israel had done no violence. Like, the entire most of the prophets are about, Israel messing up over and over again, beginning to worship these other idols and being with the wicked at their death in the grave. If this is about Joseph of Arimathea, then this makes some sense. But
why is Joseph of Arimathea work? He made his grave with the wicked. That means the Jews died along with the wicked. So Jews were executed in France, actually where the Louvre is. Where the Louvre is in Paris, used to be the public execution site in France's capital, right? So at that place, there were genuine criminals who were executed there and thrown to a unmarked grave, and then Jews were killed because they didn't accept Jesus and thrown in those same graves together. So it was works perfectly. Moreover, that the servant did not commit sin and there was no deceit in his mouth. It says that explicitly. That's Israel. If I can beg you, I don't know if you could do it quickly, but it's so important for the viewer to see this. Would you just go on to Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 12? Would you do that? It's just so important that it's really worthwhile just pausing. And every person watching this, it really is important, I believe, to look these passages up. And I think it'll shock you. Because Zephaniah, unlike Isaiah, is not using poetry. And Zephaniah, a prophet who lived at the time of Jeremiah, writes, do you have it in front of you? Zephaniah 3:12. Just start right there.
Yeah, so it says...
Read it.
Yeah, but I will leave within you the meek and the humble, the remnant of Israel will trust in the name of the Lord.
Keep going.
They will do no wrong. They will tell no lies. A deceitful tongue will not be found in their mouths. They will eat and lie down, and no one will make them afraid.
Can I ask you a question? Is it possible something to be more clear than that?
I
No,
think that's pretty clear.
I rest my case. I mean, it's like, so Zephaniah is not using poetry. He's speaking about who? Again, he's not speaking about Bobby Fischer, who was a terrible, vicious, vile anti-Semite. He was a horrible person. He may have been a great chess player. One of the people who shaped Aryan with a Y thinking, Nazi thought, he's not the only person, but the contributing, is a guy whose name is Otto Winger. And he came up with the very anti-Semitic race theory about the Jew being the weaker race. He was a Jew from Austria. So we're not talking about these people. Karl Marx was a horrible, horrible, evil anti-Semite. This is not who we're talking about here. We're talking about the faithful remnant of Israel who repents and turns to God. So Zephaniah says explicitly that the remnant of Israel will ultimately, it's messianic, will be completely safe. They will not commit sins. There'll be no deceit found in the mouth. Case closed. But what's happening, my friend? People are not reading the Bible. The people are reading Harry Potter and watching Seinfeld. So of course they have no clue what's going on in Scripture.
Yeah. That's all very interesting, and I think quite convincing. So, okay, the other thing I wanted to ask you about was sort of the case for Judaism, and in particular, sort of many of the criticisms that people make of Judaism. So one very common criticism of Judaism, of at least Orthodox Judaism, is people say that Orthodox Judaism is committed to Mosaic authorship. It holds that Moses authored the Torah, and it's the direct word of God. And the sort of dominant scholarly view is that the Torah was patched together from a variety of different authors that was ultimately compiled into one work. There are different variants. There's the documentary hypothesis and the supplementary hypothesis that have slightly different variations of this. But something along these lines. And people cite for this that it seems like the Torah often will reference events that happened after the time of Moses. So, for example, it talks, there's a passage where it says, these are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over the Israelites. There are various passages where it says such and such happened, and continues even to this day, which implies that the time at which it's being written is after is after the time during the events that it's describing. So I guess I'd be curious to hear about what you think about that argument against Mosaic authorship, that it seems like the text references events that happened long after Moses, as if references things as if the events they were talking about were in the past, so it can't have been written by Moses.
One correction here. The vast majority of scholars of the Hebrew Bible do not believe this. It's the number of scholars in the world who believe in Wellhausen's theory are like not even 1% who believe. The vast majority of people who are really scholars in Tanakh do not believe this theory. Right. So you have to come from that minimalist school. And it's interesting that Wellhausen was a Christian. And there's a reason why Solomon Schechter, who was a professor at Cambridge, really quite a learned person. He's the guy who brings the Cairo Geniza to Cambridge University. He's like a giant. He referred to higher criticism as higher anti-Semitism. This is a Cambridge professor. And the reason is that what Wellhausen was thinking now is that he thought that the original Mosaic commandments that come from God were really about loving one another, love your neighbors, you love yourself, and so on. And then other texts that are, for example, about ritual laws and so on, those are later accretion and they're not authentic. Now, the thinking was, this is a German, what good thing can come from Germany? This is really where it comes from. And this is why he called it higher anti-Semitism. People have to understand what's going on here. So what he said was, what does Jesus come to do? Jesus came to get rid of all the ritual laws, like Paul. After all, the New Testament is antinomian, especially the letters of Paul, which means that what Christianity was really doing was it was rescuing the authentic godly part of the Torah and getting rid of, jettisoning the ritual laws, which are later accretions. And you identified in your question quite correctly that that there are so many different variables, and in fact, there are people who articulate documentary about it that are at war with each other because they're trying to piece together. None of them work, and I don't. You named a whole bunch of them. I'll just name like some of the problems, like the other side, the Aver Hayarden, the other side of the Jordan River. So that term is used while the Jews haven't even crossed the Jordan River, right? Very famously. So the term "the other side of the river," Aver Hayarden, is very much like the term West Coast in the West Coast in the English language. So I'll ask you a question. When writing, is the term West Coast capitalized or not capitalized? Oh, okay. So it depends, actually. It depends. So if you're referring to like the West Coast, like someone's from LA, right? So it is capitalized because it's the name of a place, the West Coast. But if it's a compass point, the West Coast, means the West Coast, it could be the West Coast of Hawaii, it could be the West Coast of anything, right? So then it's not capitalized because it's just a compass point. So the term Aver Hayarden, the other side of the Jordan, is capitalized. Now, there are no capitals in Hebrew, but the part, whereas today is under Jordanian rule, which today present-day Jordan, that area is called Aver Hayarden, which means the other side of the Jordan, but it's capitalized. Now, again, Hebrew doesn't have capitalized, so therefore it's always called. That means you could be in Europe and someone asks you, where are you from in America? And the person says, I'm from the West Coast. So even though you're in Norway or whatever, so what does that have to do with Europe? The answer is it's uppercase. So you have that in the Jewish scriptures. And one other thing is that I think people who oppose Mosaic authorship are really strawmanning the case, and they really shouldn't be. They need to steel man this. And what I mean is they're presenting a view that we don't have and then attacking it. Look, I encourage people, no matter what your view is, if you have a bias, which we all have opinions, to be willing to challenge those opinions by steel manning what your opponent's view is, not straw manning it. So they're presenting it as though the Torah is Moses' musings, and the Jews believe that it was divinely inspired, but it's basically Moses was the filter for it, right? But that's a straw man. It's not what we believe. The Torah, which Moses writes at the very end of his life in chapter 31, verse 9, verse 24, was written every letter, every word exactly as God told him. So we don't hold the view that Moses had any creative input in what is written in the Torah. So when God told him to write something, he could be he's speaking to every future generation, not only the generation that sees it for the first time. In fact, it can't be that. This is a little tricky, but the Torah was only written down at the end of Moses' life. The whole book of Deuteronomy spans a period of time of about 6 or 7 weeks. The last 2 months of Moses' life is the whole book of Deuteronomy, right? Deuteronomy 31 is the very, very end of his life. But the Jews received the commandments, 613 commandments, 40 years earlier at the beginning of the journey in the wilderness. So it can't mean that. So I want to say to people who question these things, I don't know you, but I am certain that it's really important to you to know if the Torah is from God or if it's not from God. The consequences are staggering. I don't even have to ask you. Of course, it would be enormously influential in the future of your life, how you conduct yourself, if you believe the Torah is God-given. So what you always want to do is, if you go, you're doing a really good thing, you're going to Judaism because that's the original. There's Occam's razor. There's no later accretions. You're going back to the original. But it is important to say, okay, what is your claim? So the claim is not like the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is different than the Torah. Isaiah was a prophet who received divine inspiration from God and then wrote down these prophecies in his own words through his own filter, through his own creative writing. And that's why we find very striking difference between Isaiah and Jeremiah. Like they couldn't be written more differently, right? It's very clear who's writing what. Okay? So, yes, that would really apply in the prophet. It doesn't work for the Torah because the claim is never that Moses was writing through his own filter, but rather Moses writing word for word, and the text was written for all future generations. Another just caveat to fully answer your question, when Isaiah preached his numinous oracles, who was he speaking to? I mean, when he was thinking as he's writing, who was he speaking to? He was speaking to his own audience. Okay, and it was then considered that this is actually vital and germane to every future generation, right? But the initial writing he was speaking to an audience. He's what's called an oracular prophet. Okay, but that's not the case with the Torah. The Torah is speaking to all future generations from the get-go. So that's why none of these arguments are strong. They're very thin. Conversely, we're always doing this. We're always weighing, evidence. So the evidence against Mosaic authorship is there. It's just very thin. The evidence for Mosaic authorship is fantastic. And most importantly, I would posit, is because it's like Einstein. So many of Einstein's theories in the very early 20th century were unverifiable when he articulated them. And it was only years later when scientists were able to take telescopes to far off places, waiting for an eclipse, to see to observe gravitational pull on celestial bodies, that they were able to then confirm what Einstein had said years earlier. And this happens repeatedly, and even in the last 25 years or so, some of Einstein's theories are only borne out now. That's why Einstein is regarded, lahavdil, almost like a Moses. And I remember a few years ago in that giant, whatever it is, like that 27-kilometer spinning thing that measures, photons or whatever they have in Europe, where they thought they had measured a particle that was moving faster than the speed of light. I don't know if you recall that. You remember, right? So you remember that. So this thing, which costs billions of dollars, right? It's in Europe. It's this big, I think it's 27 kilometers, right? And it shoots things that are nearly the speed of light, like 99.9. And it's very useful. But the thing measured something that moved. The measurement said it was faster than the speed of light. What was the response in the scientific world? The response immediately was, this is not possible. Because based on, I'm not a physicist, but I know what they said. They ultimately said that's absolutely not possible because nothing could move faster than the speed of light. It just can't be. Okay? This is, you don't need a physicist to know these principles. Just like I don't have to understand computer science to be able to operate, to know how to operate a computer. I don't have to know how an engine works to drive a car. But they scientists around the world immediately, with one voice, said, do it again, you're going to find it has to be wrong. So that was an article of faith because here they had what seemed to be putative evidence that something did. But the Einstein had been proven correct so rigorously. And what's the gold standard, both with the hard sciences and with Judaism, is the ability to predict things that are really quite unlikely and counterintuitive. So the Torah makes predictions about the Jewish people, as an example, that the Jews would be hated throughout their history, but nations would marvel at our wisdom and intelligence. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 7 and 8. The nations would gaze upon your Torah. What a wise nation this is. But they would hate you and expel you, and you would be spread throughout the world. See Deuteronomy 4, same chapter, verse 27, right? And you'll be few in number, but I will bring you back to the land. See, that's very unlikely. So the Torah is making predictions that are so striking and counterintuitive. Now, there are other nations that have ancient histories. We don't have monopoly, like the Chinese. But if I asked you, which I'm not, because I know what your answer would be, why have the Chinese survived for so long, even though they've endured vicissitudes, Genghis Khan and so. Well, you tell me, because China's huge. They had a lot of fortification, and there's a lot of these people there, and it's the largest, most successful race on the planet. So they made it, and they survived Mao and everything. But the Torah says that everything that would contribute to the longevity of a nation would not apply to you. You wouldn't be like the Chinese. You'd be numerous, most numerous, but actually the fewest of all the nations. See Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 7. As they said, for the Torah is saying that you'll be exiled from your land, not for a brief time, but for a very long time. Hosea chapter 3, verse 4 and 5. But one day you'll return back, and Jerusalem will be in your hands. Why? Because you'll defeat all your enemies. And then there'll be an attack. Well, what nation comes back to its land after 2,000 years? So it is. I certainly concede that there are very valid questions. I cannot explain, and I can't even begin to explain, how kangaroos made it onto Noah's Ark. I don't know. The Torah doesn't think it's really important, and I feel fairly confident that if you and I can go back in time and go back to the time of the flood in the year 56 after creation, we will go, wow, why didn't the Torah mention that? Well, I don't know. So we'll find it out one day, maybe. I don't know, but it's not important to us. So it doesn't mean you don't have a question, but none of these are existential. So it is true that people who question Mosaic authorship are using such thin arguments, but the national revelation, which we discussed in the previous show together, which is unprecedented, which really can't be made up, because I can persuade you that I did something extraordinary, or God spoke to me, maybe, but I can't persuade you that God spoke to you. And the text is saying, remember what God told you. Well, who read that for the first time? And remember what? It never happened. And the text directs you and says, look, if you're not sure about it, the text says, Sha'al avicha, Deuteronomy 32, v'yagercha zikenecha v'yemulach. If you have any questions, God says to the reader, of all future generations, ask your parents, your elders, they know all about it. Well, if it never happened, if the thing is fake, is Roswell, and I know there are people who believe in whatever, it's a fake, well, why would you be telling me as my grandmother? They wouldn't know a thing about it because you just invented it. And moreover, it's the most credible claim in national revelation, and yet no other nation ever successfully made that claim. And to show you the Torah is speaking to all future generations, in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 32, the passage begins by saying, "Shall know liyom yishanu," saying to every generation, ask yourself all times gone past, any other nation ever did such wonders and miracles. So it does not mean there aren't mysteries. In fact, the Torah says there are mysteries, and they belong to God. Deuteronomy 29, verse 29. That's how Deuteronomy 29 is. But there are secret things belong to God, but that's revealed belongs to us and our children forever, and we keep all the words. There are mysteries. There just can't be contradictions in the Torah.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a lot there that I would want to comment on, but hard to talk about it all. I guess I'll briefly respond to the point about the documentary hypothesis. So it's true that the original documentary hypothesis, in the way proposed by Wellhausen, where he said, there are these four authors, J, E, P, D. We can attribute these precise themes J, these precise themes to E, and so on and so forth. This has fallen out of favor. But other views that, like the supplementary hypothesis, which holds that there were rounds of editing, those are now the scholarly mainstream. The view of Mosaic authorship is adopted by relatively few scholars. The point about the the other side of the Jordan. That's an interesting point. I'll have to think and read more about that one.
Okay, let's just keep this really simple. Okay, there's a reason why scholars are fighting with each other. It's the same reason why the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church fight with each other over the doctrine of the Trinity, because people are making this up. That means if it's as transparent as the minimalist world in academia make it out to be, then why are they fighting so much? Why did the church fight over the doctrine of the Trinity? Arius versus Alexander, the bishop, and they had to be solved at the council, and it wasn't solved there. And why does the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church argue over the filioque? Why? Because it's made up. This is so transparent. I want to share this with you. Listen to me. In the reason why this is in academia, it's in that little echo chamber. This is important for you to know, is that the academic world, these are soft sciences. This is humanities. This is not hard sciences, right? You are rewarded for coming up with something novel and new that sort of undoes what was formerly thought to be conventional. You understand this? I mean, in order to write a dissertation, you can't say that what was always understood to be correct is correct. Your dissertation will be thrown out the window. I have a number of friends. One is a very dear close friend of mine who wanted to do his dissertation at Hebrew University on why Daniel was written by the book of by Daniel is really the authorship is from the time of Daniel. And he was told very explicitly that if that's your dissertation, you'll never get a job in academia. I'm not saying it's North Korea, but there is an orthodoxy in academia that a priori, this is what we believe. Moreover, academia cannot rely on miracles. It has no measuring tool for that. So whenever you talk about the academic world, you're in a world where something new and different and revolutionary and counterculture or counter-orthodoxy, lowercase o, is incentivized. You're rewarded for that. You get to publish. You get to be interviewed. You get your PhD for that. So these things have to be. Why the argument? Now, I want to come back to this here. Now, somebody wrote Deuteronomy 15 as an example. The Torah says, "And you shall remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. And therefore I'm commanding you these commands this day." Now, somebody wrote Deuteronomy 24, "Don't pervert justice to an alien, to the orphan, but you should remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you." This is Deuteronomy 24, verse 17, 18, okay? Somebody wrote that, okay? Somebody wrote that. That wasn't produced by ChatGPT, okay? Somebody wrote it. Somebody wrote that for the first time. Those two passages didn't exist at some point. Somebody wrote it down, okay? And then someone reads it for the first time. And whoever is reading it is told that you should behave this way because you remember that you were slaves in Egypt, okay? And then God brought you out through miracles. Exodus 13, verse 3, Moses said to the people, "Remember this day in which you went out of Egypt." Now I ask you a question. The nation of Israel is commanded to remember events and to behave in a certain way based on their own memory. Who read this for the first time? Somebody read it for the first time. Oh, if it never happened, they would go, "What are you talking about? Remember what? What are you asking me? And why would I behave myself this way when it never happened?" If I told you that the United States had a war with Canada in the 1950s, you'd go, "That's crazy. I wasn't around in the 1950s, but I certainly would have heard about it." Like, that's just so these are monumental facts. And then people who subscribe to documentary hypothesis are going, "Well, there are different names of God. Like that's the best you can come up with." The name of the order of events in Genesis 1 or 2 don't seem to be. Now, I should say, now that I've attacked the minimalist world, there are some scholars from the academic world that reject documentary hypothesis. One could say, one of the greatest scholars of the Old Testament in the academic world is Umberto Cassuto, who's a giant. He was a genius. He was the last person to see the Aleppo Codex intact in Syria, right? He was a giant. He gave 8 lectures on totally blowing away documentary hypothesis. Now, doesn't mean he's right, okay? He was a giant by every standard. He was an academic. He was a professor at Hebrew University. Hebrew University is not a center of Hasidic Judaism. Let me just assure you that, okay? Now, what I've just said to you might be new, that you've never heard about this before, right? I'm just going to guess that, okay? And the question is why? Like, why is there this North Korea style of all the people who are biblical Bible scholars who disagreed with documentary hypothesis and did not hold conventional, traditional Orthodox views at all? It means he does not hold what I hold. Because I'm bringing these are hostile witnesses, a lot of guys like this, who wrote, you can go on Amazon, it's very inexpensive, the copyright's over, it's an 8-section work on documentary where he just rips all things apart. The question for you is, why don't people mention this? Why don't people mention, like, people will talk about parallel universes as, when trying to explain cosmology, question string theory. I don't know what any of that really means. I'll just assume you don't either. But, people will quote the different historians on what happened during the fall of the Roman Empire in 476. How did it happen? There's quite a disagreement. If you had been in the western part of the empire, what exactly would you observe as the greatest empire known to man collapse? Was it a violent collapse where, did the Visigoths just rip the place to shreds? Or was it something where it just happened casually? You could barely notice it. And basically Rome died by accidentally committing suicide to a Germanic tribe. I mean, big historians disagree over this. And we all know why this is important because, could this happen in the United States? So no one goes nuts and no one tries to suppress this. If you study history and the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, your professor, without flinching, will tell you all the theories of how did the Roman Empire fall. Why? Because there's no vested interest in it. There's no biases. We don't really care. We care because we want to know what could happen to present-day empires like the U.S. empire. We don't talk today, but it's the most powerful country that the planet has ever known. So I ask people to use the same vigorous methodology. They would listen to all sides, even from within the world of academia. But if you're only awarding people, doctorates, by writing something new, you might be skewing your result. And again, why does the Orthodox Church disagree so much with, I don't know, with the Roman Catholic Church over the Mass, the Eucharist? Because it's all made up. So they're making it up as they're going along and just trying to reverse engineer it into what they already believe. That's really what's going on.
Yeah, but so it's true that there can be cases where something is made up, and because it's made up, people disagree about the details. The Oriental Orthodox and the Eastern Orthodox fighting about whether Christ has one nature that's both fully human and divine, or whether he has two natures, one of which is fully human and divine, and they both call each other heretics over this, right? But there can also be cases where there's lots of disagreement about how exactly something works, even though there's broad consensus that the thing happened. So, there's lots of disputes among evolutionary biologists about exactly the way that most evolutionary processes work.
Perfect. But I want to make a case here. Do you know that the arguments that exist in the area of evolutionary biology, people don't call each other heretics. That's the point. Why the vitriol? I mean, the reason why it's vitriol is because people have a stake in it. Why don't people who disagree over what happened in the it's the ancient world, but in the 5th century, how did the Roman Empire collapse? So historians differ widely on what happened exactly, right? But why don't they call each other names? And why do professors dispassionately describe all the theories without all this craziness? Well, the reason is because it doesn't matter. Do black holes exist? Or it doesn't matter how you're going to live your life. So I'm just saying people got a dog in it, and I would just say that don't straw man the issue. We're not suggesting, that means, that Moses had any influence on writing Torah. One caveat someone was ask, I'll tell them the last 8 passages of the Torah, according to Jewish tradition, was written by Joshua. Moses died. But that's all. So we don't claim that Moses wrote this from his own knowledge. We do claim that Isaiah was divinely inspired, but Isaiah had a very huge influence over the way the book was written.
When people argue for the documentary hypothesis, or not just the documentary hypothesis, but for one of the views on which there are multiple authors, they sort of cite 3 broad classes of argument. They say there are stories that are repeated, they say there are stories that contradict each other, and they say there are stylistic differences. So I guess I'd first be curious to hear your thoughts on the stylistic differences point. So if we look at, for instance, in Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy is Deuteronomy is different in the use of the circular inclusio, so the kinds of sentences that start and end with a phrase. Deuteronomy is different in that it mean in how often the word ani comes up versus anochi.
Right.
And so given these very substantial stylistic differences running throughout the Deuteronomy, there are also similar stylistic differences that you get from the different alleged sources. This makes sense if it's multiple authors, but one author doesn't, write down one sentence in one style, then switch to a different style, then go back to the first style.
Deuteronomy is a very different style because it was vital to God to record the text through the eyes of Moses. Deuteronomy, literally, those words point to a second law. And it doesn't just mean that there are, I believe, 130 commandments in the book of Deuteronomy that are not found in the first 4 books of Moses. But Deuteronomy is striking in that the text is written through the eyes of Moses, and it's recorded that way. Although you have other texts in the Torah, it's not written that way. God chose to use the lens through Moses. Maybe I'll give you an example. When Pharaoh is having a conversation with Joseph, Pharaoh did not speak biblical Hebrew, right? So for whatever reason, the Torah was written in a way that translates whatever Pharaoh said from the native language to biblical Hebrew. For whatever reason, in the book of Daniel, in chapter 2, when Daniel is speaking to Nebuchadnezzar, and I chose these as a comparison because it's the same kind of context. Nebuchadnezzar, too, is seeking to find an interpretation of the dream. The author says in verse 4 that we're going to actually start recording in Aramaic. And it actually just continues in Aramaic because the verba was important to preserve. So God viewed it as vital to preserve the book of Deuteronomy as a first-hand, first-person view and did not view the other 4 books of Moses that way.
This isn't just about the stylistic differences between the book of Deuteronomy and the rest of the Bible. It's about the stylistic differences between the passages that are attributed to the P source and the passages that are attributed to the J source.
You're presupposing that there are different sources. The Torah is not univocal in that the book of Leviticus is very much devoted, not exclusively, very much devoted to what's called Teiras Kahanim, the laws that regard to the priestly caste. And how people like myself, I'm a descendant of Aaron, I'm a priest, how we should conduct ourselves. And other books are devoted to other areas. The book of Genesis is very much there to explain the development of the world and ultimately the emergence of the children of Israel. So they do have a different view in mind. Exodus is very much devoted to the nationhood, the inauguration of the nation of Israel. And therefore, there would be stylistic differences that are employed.
Right. But so And I guess this will be the sort of last comment on this element of the evidence for the documentary hypothesis, because I want to just discuss some of the other lines. There's so much to discuss and so little time, unfortunately.
I just think what's happening is that to people who espouse documentary hypothesis, they begin with the goal, like this is where we want to get. We know that the authorship is human and not divine. And that would be okay if you find fragments of the New York Times, because the New York Times doesn't claim to be the Word of God, right? So what's happening is that if you begin with a document that claims to be divinely inspired and you presuppose it isn't, so what you're doing then is you have your view, and then you're then saying, well, how could we tweak it so that it somehow reflects that? And they're ignoring the huge part of all this. And this is recording a history of a people who are called upon to remember that history, to recall that history, and to live their lives in a certain way. So if you start off your studies by presupposing a certain result, the question is how to get there. So of course you'll have these questions about linguistics, because that's what you're going to have to do. Instead, and you're going to be like Christians trying to prove the Trinity from Tanakh. Now, you must have encountered this. The Christians are just trying to find any passage which proves the Trinity. And what happens is that these arguments are just very thin. Whereas if I wanted to prove the unity of God, the absolute unity of God from the Hebrew Bible, it would be very easy to do. I wouldn't have to come up with these very thin linguistic arguments. I would just look at the plain text. There's only one God. There's no one else besides him. So I just want to say this, that that in the academic world, they a priori do not believe that the book of Daniel was authored during the Babylonian exile. They cannot accept that for reasons that are, because then the book has to be divinely inspired. And the academic world has no way of measuring that, and it's just not part of that world. So they are coming up with evidence, but it's just the evidence for the authorship during the Babylonian exile is so strong, including eyewitness accounts, and the arguments against it are frankly thin. It's there, it's just not very strong. That you ultimately have to go, one side is being incredibly picayune and pedantic about these minor issues without seeing the larger issue, I think. And remember that our claim is that God is inspiring Moses to write this, and he's writing it for humans, not for angels. And that the way we could process different chapters is different. And we do have poetry in the Torah. It's not as common as the book of Psalms, but there's quite a bit of poetry in the Torah and the oracles of Bilam and so on, which is not typical of what you would find in the book of Genesis, although there is poetry toward the end of the book of Genesis. It's not a univocal book. Like you and I are conducting conversation using conversational English where Torah is not written that way. It's designed to spark your curiosity in different ways in different texts using different linguistic codes to produce these numinous feelings within the heart of the reader. That's why they're different, that's all. But the academic world doesn't take this into account because for them, they're not bad people, not Machiavellian, but they just come into this presupposing that God is not behind it all.
I think the traditional interpretation, you can always come up with some explanation of why there are various differences between the passages. You can always come up with some harmonization. The question is, which is more sort of natural and plausible? If it were two stories that were combined, I think you would actively expect there to be details that seem to go apart, where you'd have to tell some story about.
If I may, just for a moment, because I asked you a question, it wasn't rhetorical. Somebody wrote this book, whether it's God is behind it or man are behind it, but somebody wrote that you saw and asked the reader to remember, tells the reader, ask your parents to know more about the story. Just like when I was a child, I was born 15 years after the Holocaust, I'd ask survivors, tell me what you saw. what you heard. So, see, these are the existential questions, not this linguistic thing. Because, if I wanted to, I could sit there and come up with explanations and I'd have to. But let's ask the big picture, if I may. Somebody wrote this, by all accounts. Someone wrote Deuteronomy as an example. And the book of Deuteronomy encourages the reader to recall history. Someone read that for the first time. What did the reader think? And when the text says, follow other gods your fathers didn't know, like they were, what are you talking about? I didn't know any of these things. Remember that the people who hold this claim that monotheism wasn't the original religion of the Israelites, but rather was originally the Israelites were pagan polytheists, and then monotheism was a later mutation, a development, which stuck around and became dominant. You know that, right? That's not new to you. And then they operate out of that. Now, why is it? Why are they doing that? Why are they saying that the Israelites, this tribe, originally believed in Canaanite gods, and then eventually, somehow, monotheism emerged, right? And then they look for all these texts where they can somehow sum it up. The reason is very simple, and that is in the ancient world, monotheism was counterintuitive. It didn't. If you didn't know microbiology and you don't understand how the world works and why there are earthquakes, it wouldn't have made sense to the ancient world that there's one God that's Unitarian, because things looked too different. There didn't seem to be justice in the world. You see? So if the Jews originally were, the children of Israel originally were monotheists, and then at some stage, Jews went astray and became polytheists, like, Americans were whatever, and then some became communists. Well, if that happened, well, then it's a problem. Like, why would anyone be a monotheist in the Bronze Age? Like, that doesn't make sense. The ancients weren't stupid. They didn't understand that you and your dog share 98% of your DNA. I just want to close with this point, that people have to answer the question, what did the first readers of these books, what did they think when they were asked to recall history? Remember what happened to you. If 9/11 didn't happen, like, people would go, but there wasn't nothing happened on 9/11. What are you talking about? 3,000 Americans were murdered on a horrible Tuesday morning. You understand? The text is calling upon the reader to recall, and based on the memory of a nation, based on what occurred on October 7th, based on what occurred during World War II, we should behave in a different way. Please explain to me who read this for the first time and what were they thinking? And if it never happened, if there was no Moses, there was no Exodus, there was no nation that was delivered from Egypt, that never happened, then why would someone remember? Like, why would they write that in there? What they would do is what Paul does. I want to just contrast this with your permission. I'll close with this point. Paul has to explain away why don't the Jews believe in Jesus, right? So, and why didn't Jesus accomplish any of the things that the Messiah was supposed to accomplish based on the Hebrew Bible? This is a big problem for the early Christians. So what does Paul do? This I think will be, instructive. Paul concludes that this was actually a grand mystery and nobody knew. And in fact, that's what he would have to do. And if you see Ephesians chapter 3, verses 1 through 5, and I draw your attention particularly to Ephesians 3, 3, 4, 5, he says this was a total mystery. And I, Paul alone, have revelation that I have directly from Jesus Christ, and here it is. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 7 and 8, he says that if the generation that killed Jesus had known the mystery that's only been revealed to me, they would have never killed Jesus. I'm not kidding. Okay, so the Torah, if it is man-made, which means someone concocted this and just made this up, right? The author would have to do what Paul did, and that is claim. That's what the term mystery religion comes from, that nobody knew the secret. This is very Gnostic, that there's some secret knowledge that no one has, very esoteric. I have that secret information, gnosis, and I'm going to convey it to you. The Torah is the opposite of Gnosticism. It's the opposite of Paul. Torah is saying everybody knows about it. Ask anyone, and everyone has the revelation. And I encourage you, the viewer, to take this into account. Look, I want to just contrast Paul, Lahavel, and the Torah. Paul's saying this is a grand mystery, that there's a second coming. That's his grand mystery. And no one knows about it except me. And I have it directly from Jesus Christ, not from Jerusalem. As our Galatians 1 and 2, that's the basic theme of the opening of Paul's, I think, most important book. Okay? Consider the Torah. Torah is saying everybody knows it because everyone was there, and ask anybody about it. Well, that should blow you away. And it's not blowing people away because people have made their minds up beforehand. And I would say it's unfortunate. I would just encourage the viewer to weigh that. I'm not saying that you won't find an anomaly in linguistics. You will. But look for the bigger picture, and that is the Torah is saying everybody knows about it. Answer the question, please. Why would the author say everyone knows about it if it's something that never happened? Moreover, look, I'm not saying that I'm not interviewing you. So this is really for the viewer, okay? I'm not saying someone can't come up with some answer to that, okay? That can remove, I'm not saying it's not possible, okay? I'm just saying that if you look at the mountain of evidence that's like facing us, I'm not saying if you spend hundreds of years trying to, you can't come up with something. You can. I'm saying just the evidence for what's happening here is so strong, and the evidence against it is there, but it's so thin that this is how we make decisions on all ancient work. We say, what's the most plausible explanation? Did Julius Caesar really cross the Rubicon? The evidence can't be sure, but it's just the evidence is consistent. Look, and I say this to you because you've been exposed to the Christian religion, and I say, look at Paul. Paul has to explain something monumental, and that is, why doesn't anybody know that the Messiah is supposed to suffer, die, and rise on the third day? And if you believe it, you're saying, like, why did anybody know? Paul has to say the opposite of what Deuteronomy says. He has to say that it's a secret and only I know about it. Bingo. That's exactly what a false religion has to do. Anyways, thank you so much for having me on. And I just ask people to take these issues to heart.
Yeah. Thanks so much for coming on. I guess I'll wrap it up then. For people who didn't know, Rabbi Tovia Singer has a YouTube channel that you can check out. He also has the book, Let's Get Biblical. Very worth checking out if you want to hear more. So I recommend that. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. If you enjoyed this program, please like and subscribe.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא ואת נעשה בחפצו כל